We'll crack on now with tonight's event, and I'm very, very glad to welcome Linda Hulin to give a talk on her speciality, which is marine and maritime archaeology. And it's a subject which I think a lot of people find fascinating because it's obviously an exciting and slightly adventurous kind of subject, but we often forget about the subject matter itself, the people and the lives that they led, because they're slightly on the fringe, I suppose. So I'm really looking forward to learning more about sailors in the late Bronze Age in particular, in the Mediterranean world. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you for listening. Thank everybody for coming. So I want to think about the maritime world, say, in the Eastern Mediterranean, second half of the second millennium BC. The period's been referred to as the first international age, a time when networks in their most attenuated form extended from Anatolia in the north to Sudan in the south, from Mesopotamia in the east to Sardinia in the west. This extreme connectivity was sustained by improved nautical technologies that reduced transit times, enabled the movement of bulk goods, and enabled the development of secondary value-added industries, that's to say fine tablewares or pottery containers of various shapes and sizes. These last make up the bulk of our archaeological evidence for ancient trade and trade routes, through the identification of public production centres to the mapping of the places where they ended up abroad. But I want this evening to talk about the lives of people who spent their working life on the sea, sailors and later fishermen. Now it's going to be a lot, you're going to hear the phrase "we don't know" a lot this evening, because most of what we do know concerns merchants and trade, rather than sailors and seafaring. I'm going to be very sweeping with chronology, in fact I'm barely going to talk about it at all, to construct any kind of story. So Diane Harris Klein produced this very useful conceptualization of Greek shipping in the Mediterranean using active network theory, derived from text. Her data is later than the focus of this talk, between the 8th and 4th centuries BCE, but the network could usefully be applied to many periods. This diagram combines the infrastructure needed to produce trade goods and move them from inland markets to the coast, and the infrastructure required for trade and the inbound and outbound movement of goods, and for the production and maintenance of ships, and then it overlays them onto a map of human and physical relationships to create an ecosystem of Greek shipping. Broadly speaking, the right-hand side of the network deals with the lives of mariners, and we can see that they revolve around ports, ships, and the practicalities of travel. And speaking even more broadly, the study of ports and harbours privilege one of two perspectives: the view from the sea or the view from the land. In the former, ports are viewed as the coastal manifestation of terrestrial trade and power. The focus is on the relationship between traders and the state and the onward distribution of imported goods. In the latter, the focus is on local topography and geomorphology and built or otherwise infrastructure. And of course, we need to talk about these as they are the arena in which the lives of mariners were played out. But I will conclude by discussing ports and harbours as the providers of services to sailors, not merchants, to shift the emphasis away from what the state requires and from what merchants want sailors to do, to how sailors do what they want to do and their needs and requirements. What evidence do we have for ports in the late Bronze Age? Well, it's not much, and it's spread across time and space. Arguably, the most complete evidence we have is from the kingdom of Agaric in Syria, where texts provide a wealth of economic data, where the houses and storerooms of wealthy merchants have been excavated, where storerooms and warehouses have been found in the harbours of the city. There were two at Ras Ibn Hani and Minat al-Baida. But we don't actually have evidence for facilities at the shore's edge. On the island of Thera, we have a fresco showing a flotilla of ships, the purpose of which is not entirely clear. For our purposes, though, we don't see any jetties or ships at anchor. It shows a waterfront rather than a harbour. There are no docking facilities. Foreign ships at anchor are shown in tombs at Thebes in Egypt, specifically those of Ipuyi and Kenamun. This is part of a scene from the tomb of Kenamun, which we will return to at more than one point in the evening. It shows so-called Asiatic ships from the Levant anchored on the lip of the river's edge, which would probably have been revetted since Nile silt is so unstable. But the facilities, such as they are, seem ephemeral. A scribe sits on a folding stool to receive the transport jars, and a number of booths selling petty items are ranged behind. Komos, in Crete, provides the most solid evidence for ports and comes at the end of the century, end of the period around 1300 to 1100 BCE. What we have are in kind of orangey brown in the bottom right-hand corner, ship sheds for the storage of boats in the off-season or possibly for repair. But there are no slipways and no evidence of jetties. And in fact, some people have gone so far as to say they're probably not ship sheds at all, but the proportions in terms of length and width would seem to indicate that they are. It's probable then that in all these examples and every other port, that wooden landing stages were built with mooring posts, but they have not survived, or that ships would have anchored offshore and unloaded either onto small boats or the goods would have been carried ashore. You think about topography. Clearly, some port locations are more favourably situated than others, and these two small diagrams here are by Lucy Blue when she imagines various kinds of headland geomorphology which would provide shelter. So we can offer a technical classification of headlands and bays that would have been safer for ships to shelter. It's no accident that the northern trading cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Arwad consist of basically two halves, a settlement on the shore and an island just off which provided shelter for ships. And even though evidence for harbour features are largely absent, we know about many coastal settlements that were significant ports just by the sheer quantity of imported goods found at them. So we do know where trade happens. This is a fairly old National Geographic map from the 1980s, but it still gives an idea of the complexity of trade and the places engaged in it. And of course, this is very much a map of places that archaeologists have found. It gives a good idea of the circulation of goods and the kinds of things that are moving around. So the red arrow finishes at the port of Agarit, which has received tin and is conveniently opposite the port of Enkami in Cyprus, which is exporting copper. Of course, you need copper and tin to make bronze in the Bronze Age. The large arrow running from southern Crete to Mars Matruh on the coast of the western desert of Egypt does so because there is an island there, which I'll talk about later, that was indeed engaged in international trade. But the winds and currents from Crete make it much more likely that in fact ships went directly south and to the Green Mountain area in Libya and then along the coast from there. So there are likely to be stops there that we don't know about. Interstitial stops between ports will also be of interest later in this talk. And some of these locations where there are ports have richer hinterlands than others that can support a varied population. Some lie close to pre-existing terrestrial trade routes or seats of power. Those seats of power also have the ability to mitigate deficiencies in physical geography by redirecting trade routes in their favour, intensifying agricultural production in the hinterland, and encouraging or investing in related industries such as weaving sailcloth, cutting anchors, and so forth. I'm going the wrong way. There. When ports are viewed from the land, the focus is on terrestrial trade and power. That's to say, the relationship between traders and the state, and the onward distribution of imported goods, which itself has modelled our interpretation of shipwrecks. The organisation of trade, and particularly the relation of merchants to the state, is a large and unresolved subject. At Ugarit, King Nickmaper exempted a merchant from taxes on the cargo from one particular voyage, saying neither his grain, nor his beer, nor his oil will enter the palace. However, such an exemption only points to the presence of a wider rule, in which the palace routinely applied tax to incoming goods. And even in this case, the merchant is not entirely free from obligation, as the text goes on to state that if his ship comes back from Crete, he will bring his present for the king, and the herald will not come near his house. So the king still got his cut. There are also, in the Ugaritic archives, numerous instances where the palace provided the finance for overseas ventures, but delegated the specifics to merchants who arranged the collection of the cargo at the start of the voyage and the storage and onward movement of goods. In such cases, the merchants were not acting independently, but in the employ of the state. We have texts where Cypriot merchants appeared in quasi-diplomatic roles, so their true independence is not certain either, but also because the structure of the Cypriot state is equally unknown. The hapless, famous Wenamun, at the end of the Late Bronze Age, also acted for an institution. He was sent by a temple to purchase cedar to make a bark for the temple of Amun. He was sent to Byblos and had all sorts of problems. Such official trade, or at least the type of trade that is talked about in texts, is exemplified by the Uluburun shipwreck, which foundered off the coast of Anatolia around 1306 BCE. Its loss was a financial disaster as well as a personal one for the families of those on board. Its principal cargo was bulk metal, 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of tin, the ratio needed to make bronze. This is a large amount, comparable to a single shipment mentioned in the Amarna letters. It also contained at least 149 maritime transport amphoras, a shape that emerged just for shipping. And that constituted the secondary bulk cargo, and most contained terebinth resin. And the remainder was a mixture of high-end gold and silver scrap, pendants, a ring of Queen Nefertiti that was already old by then, a statuette covered in gold foil, a range of beads in gold, semi-precious stones, faience, and even amber making its return journey to Europe. And there were other things to make things with: African blackwood, ivory and hippopotamus tusks and hippo teeth, tortoise shell, ostrich egg shells. And the ship also carried a range of edibles: wheat and barley, almonds, pine nuts, figs, olives, grapes, pomegranates, and flavourings such as safflower, black cumin, and coriander. And there were also quantities of fineware bowls and jugs from Cyprus. And such a high-value cargo makes it likely that the Uluburun ship was sailing from one port to just another, port-to-port trade, or along limited and fixed routes from one elite centre to the other. It's thought that it was possibly coming from Ugarit, but almost certainly going to the workshops of Mycenae. There are also textual references to such port-to-port trade, with Egyptian and Ugaritic ships each travelling in convoy to a predetermined port. So if you go back to the Kenamoon scene, this may reflect this type of venture, given that there are 5 Asiatic ships lined up in a row, although equally they could just represent a group of individual ventures, since different types of engagement are illustrated at the water's edge, but they would be just to show the range of things that Kenamoon oversaw. Thinking about the organisation of ports then, clearly it was in the interest of state structures to protect the interest of trade, but we have very little information about exactly how ports operated. Ras Shamra text 34147 lists ships belonging to the king of Carchemish that are old and to be taken out of use, so clearly there was an official mechanism for dealing with such vessels. Another text refers to the purchase or construction of ships on behalf of Cyprus. Both of these imply some state management of dockyards. In the kingdom of Ugarit, everyday management of the city was devolved to the prefect, who was responsible for a range of overseers, although the words used are confusing since they blend functions with institutions. So there is an overseer of the Temetet, which is a word for a pier, but it's also used for a guild active on the shore in some capacity. And there is an overseer of the Karu, which is a word for both a mooring place and the society of merchants. So it's been suggested that this equates to an overseer of the harbour in terms of taxes, and an overseer of manpower at the shore, dockers and possibly seamen. KTU 481 lists ships in Madu, one of the ports, which could either refer to the ship's captain or to their owners. Scholarly consensus favours that they refer to ship's captains, but we don't know if they were captain owners or whether they were captains in the service of owners. So while it's difficult to distinguish between merchants who own ships, states who build ships in their own yards for use of merchants acting on their own behalf, and captains who ply their trade informally, we can posit that this last group existed as a category, independently or not. They don't appear in text, but we can look to another wreck, the Geladonia wreck, found about 50 kilometres from Uluburun at Cape Geladonia, to model these type of ventures. The ship sank off the Anatolian coast around 1200 BCE. Like Uluburun, its primary cargo was metal, but there the similarity ends. The Geladonia wreck carried a mixture of old agricultural implements and tools, a few ingots and part ingots in a basket, plus crucibles for melting copper. A balance scale and a Canaanite-style set of weights, but in a wide range of metrologies from across the region, was also found, suggesting that this was a ship that didn't go from one port direct to another, but that tramped from port to port, the cargo varying depending upon what was bought and sold, cabotage rather than direct trade. And we can almost see this in action at the site of Mars of Matruh on the coast of the western desert of Egypt. There is an island there within a lagoon system that offers shelter from storms. On the island were found 2 or possibly 3 rooms with eating and drinking vessels from across the Mediterranean found there, not in storage, but just individual bits left over. A storage area to the north with cattle bones and shellfish. And there were also fragments of ostrich eggs, a valuable commodity scattered around the place. We know it's valuable because one ostrich egg shell found in the palace of Mycenae had been fitted with solid gold collar. The southern part of the island, down here on the left, shows what the eggs and food were traded for. It was littered with drills of copper and used crucible fragments that had been used to make arrowheads and hooks and fish hooks on demand, remembering that this part of the region had no access to metal on its own. 25 kilometres up the coast, to the west, lay the Egyptian fortress of Zawiat al-Raqam, which had no good shelter and no recognisable harbour, but a relatively shallow seabed where ships could anchor offshore. And we know from the Edict of Horemheb that probably such fortresses had to try and provision themselves as much as they could, and they were the last port, the last stop of Egypt before the Libyan territory started. So they were in the middle of nowhere. And once again, there is evidence of petty trade, with small metal items being manufactured on the spot. And that would have been the reason to call in. But there's also some highly peculiar Cypriot pottery. These so-called teapots down here on the left are not that common on the island of Cyprus itself, and they're very rare outside it. So their presence in this isolated spot is extraordinary. We don't know exactly what was drunk from them, obviously not tea, but they speak to a specific practice and arguably a good salesman. They're small, they're portable, and just the kind of curiosity that constitutes sailors' trade. And sailors' trade flourishes best within a trampling model rather than a direct elite port-to-port model. When we think about ports then, from a mariner's perspective, while it's reasonable to assume that the bigger the port, the better the trade was for cabotage, what we don't know, because of more things just gathered there, what we don't know is how officialdom engaged with smaller scale maritime trade. We don't know if there were charges on smaller boats plying their trade in ports, as they're never discussed. If there were, then it would have been an incentive to call in at smaller harbours in the vicinity rather than larger ports. Although again, it's possible that these were also under official control. Another Ugaritic text, KTU 4390, mentions a ship from Cyprus that is currently at Atalik, a locality further south. Was this a management of overspill from main ports or an enforced stop? In some respects, it doesn't matter whether the mariners were also merchants or not, or whether the route was direct port to port or more ad hoc cabotage. The practicalities of sailing and navigation would have been the same for them all. From a mariner's perspective, ports serve as a locus of facilities, and mariners not only need facilities of trade, but they need other things as well. Michel Foucault thought that ships constituted heterotopias, spaces where, in a sense, the normal rules of society are different, and heterotopias act as a social safety valve for the wider community. Sailors' quarters perform the same function. They are places where sailors can hang out together, catch up with people they've met in other ports, recover from illness or accident. Their existence stops essentially wayward types wandering over the city and causing trouble. We know then that at the end of the sailing season, merchants from Bora were obliged to leave the city of Ugarit. What we don't know is if this applied to their sailors as well. Returning to commerce again, Centre German and I argued that building N, well, one with a big N, was such a place. It's not a whole quarter, of course. It consists of a few rooms, but they have unusually high levels of eating and drinking and pouring vessels there, with one room also having a large quantity of cooking vessels. In other words, just the kind of eatery one might have hoped for, close to the shore, away from the town. Now let's think about the structure of crews. The Late Bronze Age saw rapid advancements in ship technology, which in turn demanded a change in skills required to sail them. Much has been made of this, that the introduction of a square-brailed sail led to the professionalisation of sailing, a professionalisation aided by a massive scaling up of waterborne trade, which would have left little time for anything else. The issue of professionalisation is important, since it sets sailors apart from non-sailors. Let's unpack this assumption a little further. Certainly the skills needed to sail a Late Bronze Age ship are a long way from those needed to power the paddled longboats that traverse the sea between Cyclades and Crete with minimal help from a sail. There, the crew would have consisted essentially of a captain navigator and a strong coordinated force to row a boat. So while a level of competence was required of the crew, it could be mastered fairly quickly. And Cyprian Brubank argued that trade was carried out in the downtimes of the agricultural year, and that the crew probably consisted mostly of farmers, and he did this just by comparing the population size with the amount of goods that appeared to have been moved. But what would a Late Bronze Age ship crew look like? Well, all ships need a captain and a navigator, and these can be the same person, of course. But for long ventures, or one calling in at multiple ports, needing multiple local knowledges, this may not have been the case. In the age before Peripla, Greek guides the ports and their produce. These things could only have been learned by sailing on the routes in person and learning on the spot. In the ancient world, occupations were inherited, and this means that knowledge was passed down through families or through masters and apprentices. So it was enclaved, intangible heritage. It was knowledge that was itself a tradable commodity. Navigators were not necessarily confined to the service of one ship. They could take their skills elsewhere. We can see this happening all the way through to the early modern period. So valued were they. And below the captain and navigator, there would have been the crew. Now, obviously, a little more knowledge is needed to man a ship with sails rather than paddles. But once learned, much of it still relied upon brute force. And in ships as small as even the Ulburun, which is about 25 metres, the crew could receive instruction easily. Even climbing to a crow's nest, another Late Bronze Age innovation from which sailors could scout for land or for pirates at sea. It's not difficult per se. It's not something everyone's willing to do. I wouldn't, since it demands a head for heights, but it's not in itself difficult. Essentially then, being a crewman can be learned, but the learning curve is not necessarily steep. Alongside the increase in skill needed to sail like Late Bronze Age boats, the volume of trade, evidently exponentially larger in the Late Bronze Age than in previous times, suggests that sailors could credibly earn a living for most of the year. But how long was the sailing year? The Ahikar scroll, a list of ships arriving in Elephantine from the Aegean Islands during the Ptolemaic period, suggests that sailing was much reduced in the months between October and February. And medieval pilgrim accounts of the journey from Europe to the Holy Land reflects the similar pattern, as do many times in between. However, Pascal Arnaud, trawling through Roman records, argued that sailing didn't cease in these months. Instead, he argues that the perception of risk changed, and voyagers would have balanced the type of boat, the type of cargo, and the competence of the crew against local weather and local circumstances. Thus, the types of voyages recorded in the Amala letters or in Bulgarit or Elephantine may not have been the type where such risks were taken, being larger distant ventures run by institutions. Smaller vessels engaged in cabotage may have deemed it worth it, although obviously the Ulleborun ship and the Gelidonia sank, so it was a gamble that they lost. And I was add as a side note that the downtime in sailing is actually quite an active time in the agricultural calendar. In areas without irrigation, autumn is the time when fields are prepared and grains planted, as well as when olives are harvested. So the distinction between agricultural labour and sailing labour may have been blurred and contingent, just as has been suggested for the early Bronze Age. Or at least sailors returned to home villages, and crew lists from Ugarit certainly recorded the villages from which sailors came, and it's possible that sailors returned home when larger sailing vessels ceased operation. In short, I would suggest that there was a divide between captains and or navigators and the ordinary seaman, the former being a stable force within and between voyages, and the latter of varying stability. This would fit with the known fluidity of mariner life through the ages, where ports and sailors' quarters served as recruiting areas for labour for ships. Diano's identification of a text from Tyre lodged in the house of Ortendo in Ugarit. He says it's written in a Creole of languages that is not recorded in official texts, but it's clearly apparent within these letters, and he argues that this kind of Creole emerged as a bottom-up response to multilingual trade. It would be the means by which multi-ethnic crews could emerge, able to serve on a number of ships. Certainly this is a widespread phenomenon again amongst crews well into the early modern period on routes that pass through many ports in many countries, in many languages. But moving back to repairs. All ships need repairs at some point. The parts of the ship or parts of the sails. They will need to take on more anchors for use or for ballast. There are 24 anchors on the Ulleborun ship. They need to take on food and water. Clearly, the larger the port, the greater the likelihood that industries have formed in the hinterland to service those ships. The logging and dressing of wood of various types across the region for mast and oars and for planks. Growing linen for weaving sailcloth and weaving it, and the most cumbersome industry, quarrying for anchors and transporting them to the near shore, but also growing grasses, palms and reeds for making ropes. KGU 4689 lists time for a ship: 9 oars, a new piece of cloth, a hatch, a mast, and ropes and a mast cap. So clearly these were available in a well-regulated port. But to whom? It's very unclear how easy it was to access such items. It might have depended upon where the ship was, and if the shipyards were owned by the state, and under what circumstances, if any, they could be used. For example, the Egyptians imported cedar for masts and oars, but used local tamarisk and acacia for their hulls. There is some evidence of wooden planks, i.e. prepared timbers, were also exported to Egypt, as well as logs. How easy would it have been to access those if you needed them in Egypt? An Ulleborun might have been able to, backed by an institution, but would a Gelidonia? We don't know. On the other hand, short lengths of cedar were found at Tel Nami, near Haifa, as well as local woods, and smaller repairs may have been possible at smaller ports. Certainly, the Gelidonia wreck includes a rope made from dome palm fibre, which would have been acquired from Egypt or Sinai, so at least some chandlery could be acquired. And the Ulleborun wreck had a Cypriot-style anchor made from Egyptian stone on board. Could mariners have made their own, or was this a market that provided anchors to suit a range of mariner traditions? Again, we don't know. We should note that classical documents distinguish between ships entering a harbour for a few hours for water, as these were time limited, and those berthing for trade. Presumably, repairs would have fallen under the same category of longer stays, so it might be an incentive to try and get your repairs done in a smaller place rather than a larger place. So there are many reasons to stop between ports. The rhythm of sailing may mean that small crews anchor offshore overnight, ships stopping at sheltered beaches for dinner, much the best place to light a fire after all, or to spend the night, are well documented in later periods. Ships heading for Egypt from the Libyan coast, for example, may have wanted to stock up water in the Green Mountain area, and certainly by Marsa Matruh, the last area where water could be found before the Delta. Although the delta was only a day away, sailors may have chosen to rest overnight before setting off again. Islands in the Dodecanese could offer relief and rest after hard and alert sailing needed to run past Anatolia and its treacherous coast. So repairs happen where they will, and it might not be possible to limp into a port, a large port. This isn't a very clear map, I'm afraid. You might be able to see that I've underlined some. The Ugaritic archives list by name numerous villages by the sea, but they're not all commercial ports. And KT 440 lists the origins of ships' crews, as I've mentioned earlier, but it's unclear whether they were providing military or merchant service. But they come from a range of settlements along the coast. Men from Pidi, Sinaru, Gibala and Tibaco all served on one ship, suggesting a distribution of nautical know-how, which is not really surprising. Coastal settlements such as these could have been the source of knowledgeable labour for all types of ships and also for repairs. Thus, tramping vessels may have built relationships with small settlements to use their beaches, rest for the night, and resupply with water or food at lower prices than in larger ports. They might effect light repairs, acquire more rope. They would have to be paid for in small transactions, such as we saw at Marsamtru and Zawiat Amul Racham. And this is where we can bring fishermen into the discussion. These are clearly just random slides, by the way, because sailors and fishermen share technologies with respect to handling a vessel. They use the same resources to make and maintain their ship, and they share soft skills such as the ability to read winds and currents and navigation. The recent Fish and Chips project conducted interviews with elderly fishermen in coastal areas in Greece. Women were engaged in making nets and trading in fish, and this is true of a wide range of ethnographic accounts. So within villages there could be a range of nautical skills. And encounters with fishermen need not have been confined to the land. The fishing domain of the Aegean, in the fishing domain of the Aegean, for example, the north and the south is very different, with the north being rich in fish and shellfish, and the south also rich, but with deep sea fishing possible close to the shore. Migratory species tend to be caught when they entered zones close to the shore, but they did pass into the open sea. Thus fishermen would have occupied the same spaces as traders. The extent to which navigation is local feeds into the problem of exactly where fishing took place. Milana has argued against the existence of open water fishing at this stage, while at the same time acknowledging that the archaeological record is far from complete and biased towards larger fish who are eating the smaller fish. There is evidence of fishing equipment on ships, so either merchant sailors were fishing when they got closer to shore, possibly for immediate consumption during stops on land, or they opportunistically fished in open water when they came across shoals of fish close to the surface, and these net weights might also indicate that. Sailors on trade vessels who fish are clearly not the same as sailors for whom fishing is the object of the voyage, so I'm getting increasingly doubtful about how to use this kind of evidence. And also, like sailors on trade vessels, I worry that fishing communities may also have been subject to institutional oversight, as indeed most people were. We know that it cost 50 shekels to dress if you want to fish by line, or just using seine nets, which are circular nets with weights on the edge that you drop into the water, it sinks and it captures the fish. You don't need that many resources, you just need twine, which you can get from various things that are growing, and you can make string from all sorts of things. But once you start getting into anything that needs a boat, then the resource investment increases dramatically. We know that it costs 50 shekels at Ugarit to dress a pre-existing boat, but we don't know how much a boat cost. And of course, we can suppose that fishing communities might have been capable of building their own if they happen to be situated near a good source of wood. And fishermen are used to repairing vessels and sails, but it's the sail itself that may have been the problem. We assume that sails were made of flax, because that's what Egyptian sails were made of, but they could also have been made of wool. But if they're made of flax, a sail would still have been a significant investment to make. You have to set aside land for the crop. Flax needs significant amounts of water to wet the fibres, and then it has to be spun into thread and woven. Now, weaving depends upon the density of the finished cloth, and looking at wool sails, which is another possibility, especially in Crete. A modern professional weaver in Denmark took 3,600 hours to weave a 25-metre square sail, or around 16 months. A 10-metre sail, needed for the late Bronze Age ships, would take one person around 1,440 hours to make, or 180 working days. But of course, a family of 4 could cut that down considerably and cut it down to the downtime in an agricultural year, for example. We also note that Minoan seals show sails divided into squares, and it's possible that sails so divided were easier to repair. If not squares, then sails were inevitably woven into strips, so strips could be wholly or partially replaced. So this is a long way of saying that fishing villages almost certainly had the skills and the wherewithal to help make quite significant repairs, even if their willingness to do so depended upon the relationship between mariners, the relations that mariners had built up with them. But they still would have needed access to the original raw materials, and this is where we just don't know what kind of institutional oversight there might have been. That 50 shekels cited earlier to dress a ship might also have been the result of a production at scale in larger ports. We don't know how far this bled into countryside in terms of prices. So to conclude, this is an extremely speculative presentation. Although in 3 years' time we might have some more specific answers thanks to the Practical Mariner project, which began this year and in which myself and postdocs Carl Smith and Max MacDonald investigate just these issues. We aim to map ports and the potential of hinterlands in relation to their capacity to meet the needs of those who work on the sea that I've just described, and also areas between ports to highlight the potential for interstitial stops. We will combine these with maps of winds and currents and fish runs month by month, adding in the cycles of the agricultural year to produce an entire ecosystem of mariner and fishing life. We have specific research interests relating to climate change and how new trading routes emerge, but the basics of this will be an open access tool for everyone to use. And hopefully there will be fewer we don't knows at the end of it. Thank you for listening.